Hi guys, welcome to Literarily Wendy. My name is Wendy, and today I'm going to be reviewing East of Eden by John Steinbeck. First, I just wanted to say that despite my best efforts today, it has not been easy for me to get a quiet environment in which to film. You may or may not be able to hear it, but outside there is a few things going on. I have some neighbors who are taking down a tree, and so they have a tree service with some very loud equipment. And I also have a neighbor who is listening to some loud music right beside me. So I'm hoping that that doesn't get picked up on video. If it does, I'm sorry. There's not much I can do about it today. So we're carrying on. So East of Eden is a multi-generational tale spanning 50 or so years from the late 1800s and through the early 1900s in Salinas Valley, California. And this setting will not come as a surprise to you if you've read any other of John Steinbeck's novels. And this makes sense because that is where the author was born and raised. John Steinbeck was born in Salinas, California in 1902. He graduated from Salinas High School in 1919 and went on to study English literature at Stanford University. However, he left in 1925 without having earned a degree. From there, he made his way to New York City and tried to publish some of his writing, but was unsuccessful at the time. So when he was unsuccessful, he moved back home to California, where he took some odd jobs and tried some different things. He married his first wife, and he published his first novel, Cup of Gold, in 1929. From that point on, he found a lot of success as a writer, and eventually wrote East of Eden in 1952. And it seems, based on some articles I've read of him, that he really considered East of Eden to be his magnum opus. He later won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1962, and I actually found a video of him accepting that award, which you can see in a link down below. So my experience reading this book was really good. I started this book back in March, put it down for a while because I just wasn't in the mood for it, but then picked it up again recently and powered through. Prior to reading East of Eden, the only John Steinbeck novel I had read was actually Of Mice and Men, which I read initially in elementary school as part of the curriculum, and I reread it again a couple of years ago, but for whatever reason, I never really branched out to read more John Steinbeck until East of Eden. What initially struck me about this book was I wasn't really expecting it to be so philosophical. It's very much written as an exploration between good and evil, light and dark, and how we all have these two extremes within us. Even from the very beginning of the novel, where he's describing the Salinas Valley, he talks about how on one side of the valley there's these mountains that are bright and cheerful, and then on the other side there's these other mountains that are kind of dark and moody and mysterious. And a main question that I noticed coming up over and over again in this book is whether or not we have a choice as far as morality is concerned. There are themes of inherited evil. You know, if your parents are evil, does that mean you will be? Is your life predetermined to follow in the footsteps of your parents? Kind of a question of nature versus nurture. Is evil in your DNA, or is it a choice? And we see this question explored through various characters who align with different ends of the good and evil spectrum. This is predominantly done through the mirroring of the biblical myth of Cain and Abel. And the way it's written is not at all subtle. So if you aren't familiar, in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, Cain and Abel are the first two sons of Adam and Eve. Cain is a farmer and Abel is a shepherd. Both brothers make sacrifices or offerings to God. God prefers Abel and rejects Cain. As a result, Cain's jealousy leads him to kill Abel, which understandably pisses God off, and he then kind of banishes Cain to the land of Nod, which is located East of Eden, hence the title of the book. And so essentially, based on my limited understanding, the land of Nod is basically a state of being where Cain is cursed to wander the earth, and God places a mark on him so that nobody who comes upon him in life will kill him. And I'll get a little bit into the characters now and how they fit into the Cain and Abel framework. There may be light spoilers in that I'm going to be discussing the characters and some plot points and details of the characters. So the biblical story is first mirrored in the relationship between Charles and Adam Trask. They're introduced near the beginning of the novel and are the first couple of characters we really follow. They are two brothers who have a bit of a tumultuous relationship. Like the story of Cain and Abel, their father prefers Adam to Charles. And this is pointed out most strongly when the two sons each give a gift to their father. Charles gives his father the gift of a very expensive knife that he kind of saved up for, and Adam gives him a puppy who it was very easy to come by and it hardly cost him anything at all. And their father strongly prefers Adam's gift and kind of rejects the gift given by Charles. And like in the story of Cain and Abel, this causes jealousy for Charles, and that results in him attacking Adam and eventually trying to kill him, though he is unsuccessful. Later on, in an incident on his farm, Charles does get a fairly bad scar on his forehead, which is talked about as being like this dark, ugly mark, kind of like the mark of Cain. Later, Adam meets a character named Kathy, falls in love, and she gives birth to 2 sons. And this is what I mean about the parallels with the biblical story not being subtle at all, because if you recall, Cain and Abel were born to Adam and Eve, and here we have a character named Adam fathering 2 sons. And you'll start to see in this novel that characters with the first initial either C or A tend to fall into the 2 Cain and Abel archetype. And in this regard, this book does get to be a little bit predictable at times. You'll see this story repeating through generations. Some characters find redemption and others don't. So Adam's 2 sons are named Cal and Aaron, and they are the 2 that we end up following through the end of the novel. I want to talk a little bit about the character named Kathy, the one who gets married to Adam, because I thought that she was perhaps the most important character in this novel. We follow her from a very early age, and we quickly learn that there's just something off about her. She lacks empathy. She makes decisions that a moral person wouldn't make. And that's kind of what makes her such a fascinating character, because this overarching question about good versus evil and how much choice we have in what path we end up on, Kathy doesn't really fit very easily into that paradigm. I think she's a sociopath, and she's just kind of operating without all the tools that other characters seem to have. And she knows it. She knows that there's something different about her compared to other people from a very early age. But she doesn't really have a lot of insight into what's going on with her. And because of that, I don't think she really understands the goodness in others, because she doesn't seem to have it in herself. She manipulates and hurts people, but her ultimate goal in life or her motivations aren't always clear to me in this novel. She really seemed to just be operating from this space of self-preservation and discomfort with what she notices in the people around her, which she seems to view as a weakness that she herself does not possess. And that weakness, I think, is empathy or conscience, that voice that tells you that something is wrong, she doesn't seem to have. And early on in this book, there was actually a really interesting quote just as she was being introduced that I think sums her up pretty perfectly. It's at the start of chapter 8, and I will read it now. "I believe there are monsters born in the world to human parents. Some you can see, misshapen and horrible, with huge heads or tiny bodies. Some are born with no arms, no legs, some with 3 arms, some with tails or mouths in odd places. They are accidents and no one's fault, as used to be thought. Once they were considered the visible punishments for concealed sins. And just as there are physical monsters, can there not be mental or psychic monsters born? The face and body may be perfect, but if a twisted gene or a malformed egg can produce physical monsters, may not the same process produce a malformed soul?" So I thought the malformed soul aspect of this I found very fascinating, because it makes you sort of question whether or not some people are just straight up born bad and there's not a lot that can be done to turn them around. Maybe they don't feel like they have a choice in the path that they take, which is sort of counter to what the rest of the novel is saying about how you can make your own choices and you can choose the light over the dark or the good over the bad. You can set out your own moral framework and follow it any way you like. I won't go into details about the bad things she does because that's a little bit too much of a spoiler, I think, but it's really bad. Like, she does some pretty terrible things in this book, and it makes you wonder what's going on in her head. And because she fathered 2 sons, it kind of makes the novel take this really interesting approach to the sons kind of questioning where they came from and how having someone like their mother giving birth to them, how that may affect the way they live their life. So East of Eden is a story of a couple of families, yes. I've covered the Trask family, which was Adam, Charles, and then Kathy and the resulting sons from their union. And so The book is about these two families, but there's also interspersed within these stories is a series of sort of sections that delve into the history of the Salinas Valley, the economy in Salinas, California, and how it changes over the years, the introduction of new technologies and how those technologies affect the community. For example, motor vehicles and how they became a thing and how they changed the lives of people who live here. These almost poetic sections take on a bit of a life of their own. They're outside the story, but they paint this really beautiful picture of the area. It might discuss the climate, the way the seasons come and go, the way the landscape changes, and it leaves you with this vibrant mental picture of the area, which then fills up with all of these people, these characters. And so now I'm just going to read one of those sections, and so you can just see a little bit of what I'm talking about. You can see how this book has reached a great boundary that was called 1900. Another 100 years were ground up and churned, and what had happened was all muddied by the way folks wanted it to be. More rich and meaningful the farther back it was. In the books of some memories, it was the best time that ever sloshed over the world. The old time, the gay time, sweet and simple, as though time were young and fearless. Old men who didn't know whether they were going to stagger over the boundary of the century looked forward to it with distaste, for the world was changing, and sweetness was gone, and virtue too. Worry had crept on a corroding world, and what was lost, good manners, ease, and beauty, ladies were not ladies anymore, and you couldn't trust a gentleman's word. There was a time when people kept their fly buttons fastened, and men's freedom was boiling off. And even childhood was no good anymore, not the way it was. No worry then, but how to find a good stone, not round exactly, but flattened and water-shaped, to use in a sling pouch cut from a discarded shoe. Where did all the good stones go, and all simplicity? So you can see how there was this nostalgia that came and went with the eras. So I wanted to just take a minute to discuss the narrator of this book, because I went into this story not really knowing anything about it, which is usually how I like to go into a book, especially a classic book, because I like to be surprised. I like to go into it with a clean slate. I don't like to read reviews or anything prior to reading the book. I like to just take it in how it was originally intended and just let it sit on me how it will. And I'm particularly glad that I did that with this one, because it did end up surprising me quite a bit, because learning who the narrator is in this book literally had me kicking my feet with excitement as I touched on certain chapters and things sort of unfolded that way. And maybe it's common knowledge, maybe this is nothing new to anyone, maybe a lot of people go into this book just knowing this already, but my experience in finding out was just so much fun that I had to share it. So the narrator and the narrative voice kind of shifts a little bit throughout the book, and every so often you get this narrative voice come up that is told in the first person, and you're learning about all of these characters. And at one point the narrator is talking about his mother, who he says is Olive Hamilton. The Hamilton family is sort of the second major family that is in this book and heavily influences what's going on in the Trask family. And so Olive is one of Samuel Hamilton's daughters, and Samuel Hamilton is sort of this old man who shows up earlier on in the book, and he's friends with Adam, and he has this prominent family in Salinas, but they're poor, their land isn't worth much. He's really good at digging wells, he's a blacksmith, he's sort of like this really great guy, and he raises his kids to be very book smart since they don't have money. And one of Samuel Hamilton's daughters is Olive, and she becomes a teacher, and then she later on ends up having some children. So the narrator tells us this information, and then a little bit later, the narrator again in that first person voice talks about how his mother married a man named Ernest Steinbeck. And even later, there's a scene where Olive is sort of at the door. She's answered a knock at the door, and it talks about how there are these two little kids kind of hiding behind her skirts, peering out, and one of their names is John Steinbeck. So all of these little clues, even though it's not really explicitly stated, reveal to us that John Steinbeck is the narrator. And that got me wondering about how many of these characters in this book actually existed, and how much was fiction. What was real, what was his own family story, and what was made up. So after I finished the book, I wanted to wait till I was all done before I did any additional research on this, but I did some digging into John Steinbeck's family tree. And wouldn't you know it, a lot of the characters are actually just his family members. They really existed, they really are John Steinbeck's family. So while the events in the novel are fiction, there are a lot of details that do line up with reality. So that's been really fun to discover and read about after the fact. And I actually, just to give you a little bit of proof, here's a picture of the gravestone that marks the final resting place of quite a few of the Hamilton clan. So again, I had such a good time reading this book. I enjoyed it immensely. At its core, it's kind of a simple story of the difference between good and evil and how we choose one path over another. I've loved getting to know all of these characters. I think that they're such fascinating characters, and John Steinbeck has a way of writing characters that makes them just feel like they're living and breathing and popping right out of that page. I know that there is a movie that was made out of this book just a few years after the book was actually published, and I do plan on watching it at some point in the future. So if you've read East of Eden by John Steinbeck, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Let me know what you thought of this book. What were your takeaways? What did you think of Kathy? I think it's interesting that Kathy's name starts with a C because of the whole Cain and Abel thing, and she's kind of evil, right? So seeing that her name starts with that as well, it's kind of a fun little parallel. Maybe it's a coincidence, but it's fun. I'm also just going to include some pictures of Salinas because while looking up John Steinbeck's family tree, I also looked up some photos of Salinas, California during the time that this book was set. So I'll share a few of those photos here now. I love being able to look up places and see how they've changed over time, see what they looked like then versus what they look like now. I think this book will be sitting with me for quite a long time. I'm going to be thinking about Kathy. I'm going to be thinking about, Adam's character and Aaron's character. I thought it was so interesting how similar they were in that they almost deny that evil exists. Adam doesn't seem to see it in Kathy. Aaron doesn't seem to see it in the people in his life later on. And in both of their cases, it kind of drives them to unhappiness because the world isn't this beautiful place where everything is just light all the time. You almost need to acknowledge the darkness in order to see the light. And I think that was my biggest takeaway from this novel, is it's not just one or the other. We're all kind of combinations of both at different ratios, mind you. There are some people like, the Ted Bundys of the world, or, the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world, or the Kathys of the world, where they've got a lot more of that darkness in them and they let it out. And then there's people who have kind of equal parts of both. And I think Cal is an example of that because he did selfless things in this novel, but he also did awful things. He's kind of a mixed bag, and I think that's what made him such a great character too. And I guess I can't really talk about the characters in this novel without mentioning Lee. He was the Chinese American servant that lived with the Trask family. And at every step in this book, Lee seemed to be the voice of reason. No matter what was going on, he always seemed to have words of wisdom for the other characters in the book, and he seemed to put his own hopes and dreams aside in order to remain loyal to this family. And he was just such a wonderful guy. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it added a little bit of value to your day. And if it encouraged you to go out and read this book, I'm ever so glad to hear that, because this book is great. It's easily in my top 10 favorite books of all time, I think. I would love to hear your comments down below. And if you liked this video, please subscribe so that when I make new videos, you'll be the first to know. And I will see you on the next one. Bye. Boop. It tasted like good rotten apples. I don't know how to pronounce the name of the alcoholic beverage. That's great news.